You drop 5 grand on a cruise to Alaska, expecting to connect with nature. But after 3 days of no cell service and realizing glaciers move at the speed of dirt, the human brain snaps. People stop watching the whales and start fighting the ship's architecture. Here are 12 deeply bizarre, borderline unhinged ways passengers tried to cure their boredom in the freezing mist. 1. Have you ever wondered what happens when a highly analytical mind is suddenly deprived of spreadsheets and placed in front of 30,000 years of slow-moving ice? It isn't pretty. Arthur, a retired forensic accountant from Chicago, decided on day 4 of a 10-night inside passage voyage that simply looking at nature was completely unproductive. The sheer, repetitive beauty of the Alaskan wilderness had driven his corporate-wired brain to the brink of starvation, so he pivoted to the only logical alternative. He began auditing the ocean. Arthur transformed the small desk in cabin 921 into a tactical command center. He possessed an expensive tablet loaded with offline topographical maps, a pair of marine-grade binoculars he wore around his neck like a medallion, and a pocket-sized laser thermometer he claimed he bought specifically for this expedition. Every morning, when the cruise director's cheerful voice over the intercom announced that the outside temperature was 41 degrees, Arthur would march out onto his glass balcony in a plush white bathrobe, shoot his laser at the metal railing, check the ambient air reading on an external weather app, and log the exact decimal discrepancies in a leather-bound ledger. The situation escalated dramatically during scenic cruising at Glacier Bay. The ship's resident naturalist confidently announced over the loudspeaker that the massive glacier off the port bow was actively calving. Arthur, having stared through his binoculars for 2 straight hours without seeing a single block of ice fall into the water, declared this to be a fraudulent marketing tactic designed to manipulate passenger emotions. He didn't just grumble to his wife. He drafted a formal cease and desist letter on the ship's embossed stationery. He marched directly into the crowded observation lounge on Deck 12, entirely bypassed the long line for the complimentary hot chocolate, and handed the document directly to a bewildered junior entertainment staff member who was dressed in a giant plush moose costume. The letter formally demanded that the cruise line immediately stop using the word active to describe the glacier, citing his own unbroken visual surveillance as definitive proof of geological stagnation. When the muffled voice inside the moose head nervously explained that they couldn't exactly schedule when a prehistoric ice shelf decided to break, Arthur just tapped his heavy silver wristwatch, stated that efficiency is a choice, and demanded a prorated refund for the 3 hours he had just spent watching a frozen wall do absolutely nothing. 2. Let's establish a very real psychological baseline here. If you remove a person from high-speed internet and force them to look at an endless pine forest for 3 days, their brain will eventually start fabricating entertainment just to survive. Meet Sarah, a 28-year-old solo traveler from Manhattan who by the middle of her journey had developed a severe case of desperation zoology. She posted herself on the freezing open deck of a massive European vessel, aggressively scanning the water with a rented telephoto camera lens the size of a bazooka. Because the actual wildlife was refusing to stick to her personal itinerary, Sarah simply began aggressively misidentifying inanimate objects. A chunk of dirty seafoam drifting past the hull was confidently announced to the surrounding passengers as a rare albino sea otter. A partially submerged rusted logging cable became a sleeping anaconda, which didn't even make geographical sense. Her confidence was so absolute that it created a hypnotic effect on the older tourists. The climax occurred when she pointed a heavily ringed finger at a large brown fuzzy mass near the shoreline, shrieking that she had found a grizzly bear eating a fresh salmon. 14 people immediately rushed the railing, violently elbowing each other to get the perfect shot. They stood there in the sleet for 10 minutes, zooming in on what turned out to be a discarded waterlogged armchair sitting upside down on the rocky beach. Instead of admitting defeat, Sarah simply lowered her heavy camera, sighed heavily, and muttered that the bear must be wearing camouflage. 3. It is a spectacular psychological phenomenon to watch a human mind completely reject the concept of natural beauty and substitute it with aggressive micromanagement. By day 6 of a 2-week glacier itinerary, Marcus, a retired orthodontist from Ohio, was utterly exhausted by the sight of majestic fjords. To him, they were just wet rocks. Needing an outlet for his intense analytical energy, he turned his full, unblinking attention to the nightly towel animals left by his cabin steward. What started as a charming cruise tradition rapidly devolved into a hostile peer review process. Marcus began leaving heavily annotated, red-inked rubrics on the mattress next to the terrycloth creations. He deducted points for structural instability, criticized a towel monkey for being geographically inappropriate for the subarctic, and left a biology textbook open on the pillow to demonstrate the correct skeletal proportions of an Alaskan brown bear. By Wednesday, he was leaving complex blueprints taped to the bathroom mirror, demanding the steward construct a physiologically accurate humpback whale breaching out of blue pool towels. The absurdity of a grown man demanding museum-quality taxidermy made of hotel linens peaked when he marched to guest services holding a lumpy towel penguin like a piece of forensic evidence, claiming its beak-to-body ratio was ruining his wilderness immersion. The exhausted steward finally adapted. The next evening, Marcus returned to cabin 7104 to find no elaborate origami. Instead, there was just a single, flat, completely unrolled white facecloth resting perfectly in the center of the bed, accompanied by a little card that read, "Snowshoe hair, camouflaged in a severe blizzard." 4. I want to ask you a very serious question. How much gray mist and identical pine trees does a person have to look at before their brain completely fractures and they invent a nautical conspiracy theory? For Evelyn, a 64-year-old retired municipal auditor from Calgary, the breaking point arrived exactly 72 hours into a misty, overcast Alaskan voyage. Staring out at the endless, repetitive coastline of the Inside Passage, Evelyn's highly analytical mind rejected the concept of geographical scale, convinced with absolute and terrifying certainty that the 5,000-passenger megaship was not actually sailing to Juneau. This bored passenger concluded that the cruise line was executing a massive coordinated fraud. The prevailing theory? The captain was simply driving the vessel in giant, slow-motion circles in international waters off the coast of Washington state to save hundreds of thousands of dollars on marine diesel fuel. Once the boredom mutated into this bizarre paranoia, Evelyn effectively became a rogue maritime detective. Normal vacation activities were immediately abandoned. Instead of hitting the buffet, this self-appointed investigator marched into the midship dining room and hung a small brass pendulum from a chandelier. Its purpose was to measure what was loudly declared to be the undeniable centrifugal force of a perpetual portside turn. Her deeply exhausted husband, Arthur, was assigned the humiliating task of standing on the outer promenade deck in the freezing rain to deploy tactical tracking beacons. This covert operation consisted of Arthur shamefully dropping hollowed-out grapefruit halves painted with neon pink nail polish into the ocean. Meanwhile, his wife waited on the opposite side of the ship with binoculars, fully expecting the citrus to float back past them on the next rotation. Off-duty crew members trying to use the elevator banks suddenly found themselves cornered, blinded by a small pen light, and aggressively interrogated about whether the ambient seagull noises were being pumped in through the public address system via a Spotify playlist. By day 5, a cult following of equally bored, easily influenced passengers had formed around Evelyn, holding secret resistance meetings in the adults-only hot tubs at midnight under the moniker the Straight Line Society. An entire afternoon was spent meticulously compiling definitive proof. The resulting dossier was a massive, chaotic binder filled with complex geometry, tidal charts nobody understood, and a timeline of the ship's suspicious refusal to encounter a single identifiable landmark. But the crown jewel of this investigation was the photographic evidence. Dozens of time-stamped Polaroids had been snapped from the stateroom window, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the ship had passed the exact same distinct, jagged, eagle-shaped rock formation at 8:15 a.m. on Tuesday, again at exactly 12:15 p.m., and once more at 4:15 p.m. Armed with this undeniable proof of corporate deception, the auditor led a march of 7 angry seniors down to the guest services desk on Deck 4. The heavy binder was slammed onto the marble counter. Polaroids were slapped down like winning lottery tickets, and a loud declaration echoed through the crowded lobby, exposing the carousel scheme. A full refund for everyone on board was immediately demanded, along with a request that the Coast Guard be radioed to navigate them out of the infinite loop. The guest services manager, a remarkably calm man from Portugal, slowly picked up the Polaroids, looked at them, and then pulled up the guest profile on his computer monitor. He didn't call security. He didn't argue about the ship's navigational logs or show her the real-time GPS tracking. Instead, he simply turned the monitor around to face the angry mob, gently adjusted his tie, and politely asked the ringleader if she had perhaps forgotten the specific cabin category booked 8 months ago. Evelyn confidently stated she was in stateroom 11244, a premium ocean view. Offering a sympathetic, incredibly dry smile, the manager informed her that cabin 111244 was actually a deeply discounted, windowless interior stateroom located in the absolute dead center of the ship. The window being aggressively monitored for 5 days wasn't glass. It was a high-definition floor-to-ceiling LED digital screen designed to simulate a balcony, currently broadcasting a pre-recorded 4-hour looping video of the Norwegian fjords filmed in 2018. The grand maritime conspiracy was completely fabricated. This rogue detective had just been angrily auditing a television. Standing there, in absolute silence for a full 30 seconds, staring at the manager, the defeated passenger finally slid the Polaroids back into her binder, cleared her throat, and fiercely whispered that the cruise line was still liable because the virtual eagles looked completely inauthentic. 5. Let me tell you exactly what the Alaskan midnight sun does to a deeply bored passenger who fundamentally refuses to use blackout curtains. It is a fast track to mild maritime psychosis. Martin, a 55-year-old actuary from London, found himself entirely out of things to do by day 4 of a summer solstice itinerary. Unable to sleep because it was glaringly bright outside at 11:30 at night, his highly logical brain simply broke. Instead of pulling the heavy drapes shut, Martin decided the prolonged daylight was a deliberate corporate conspiracy. He became absolutely convinced that the cruise company was aiming massive, military-grade floodlights at the low-hanging clouds to artificially extend the day, forcing passengers to stay awake and spend more money in the casino. Armed with restless energy and polarized aviator sunglasses, Martin marched up to the freezing open deck at midnight to expose the operation. He aggressively inspected the ship's radar domes, loudly accusing a bewildered maintenance worker of changing the bulbs in the fake sun. After finding zero evidence, Martin stormed down to the guest services desk. He placed both hands firmly on the counter, leaned forward, and sternly threatened to contact maritime authorities if the captain didn't immediately turn off the sky projectors. The night auditor didn't argue about astrophysics or planetary rotation. He just slowly opened a drawer, slid a complimentary silk sleep mask across the marble counter, and softly whispered that the sky was on a timer and would be unplugged in exactly 45 minutes. 6. Boredom on a prolonged sea day can make people highly susceptible to local tourist marketing, especially if they possess zero geological knowledge. Yelena, a fiercely determined bakery owner from Bulgaria, had purchased a $25 authentic prospector's bag of dirt during a brief port stop in Juneau. The instructions on the canvas sack promised real Alaskan gold flakes if she just washed away the silt. Fast forward to day 6, during an absolutely agonizing 40-hour stretch of open ocean cruising back to Seattle. Yelena had grown profoundly tired of the classical string quartet in the lobby and decided it was time to process her claim. Deeming the tiny ceramic sink in her stateroom inadequate for a proper industrial operation, she packed a large plastic ice bucket, a slotted spoon stolen from the salad bar, and her bag of dirt, and marched directly to the ship's grand atrium. This particular megaship featured a massive 3-story decorative waterfall that cascaded down illuminated glass steps into a shallow marble pool. To Yelena, this was not a multi-million-dollar architectural centerpiece. This was a highly efficient sluice box. She rolled her designer jeans up to her knees, waded directly into the freezing, heavily chlorinated water, and began aggressively panning for gold right next to the glass elevators. When a bewildered junior assistant cruise director rushed over to politely demand she exit the fountain, Yelena completely ignored him, established a makeshift dam using tightly packed sugar packets she had brought from the cafe, and shouted over the rushing water that she had a legal mining right. The situation devolved into a bizarre, slow-motion standoff. 2 security officers stood at the edge of the marble pool, softly pleading with her to stop dumping raw Juneau mud into the ship's delicate filtration system. The climax of this absolute madness arrived when Yelena suddenly gasped, dropped her plastic ice bucket, and triumphantly held up a tiny glittering golden object with her tweezers. She marched soaking wet to the guest services desk, slapped her treasure onto the counter, and demanded they weigh it for its current market value. The extremely tired concierge put on his reading glasses, squinted at the shiny flake, and dryly informed her that she hadn't struck the mother lode. She had successfully excavated a piece of gold sequin that fell off the lead singer's dress during Tuesday night's ABBA tribute show. 7. What is the psychological breaking point where a luxury vacationer decides modern currency is completely obsolete? For Joanne and David, a wealthy retired couple from a gated community in Arizona, that point was reached on Thursday afternoon. After binge-watching a marathon of Alaskan wilderness survival shows on their cabin television because they were too bored to attend another towel-folding seminar, they experienced a complete ideological shift. They concluded that the ship's cashless cruise card system was an artificial trap, and they needed to embrace the law of the Yukon by establishing a frontier barter economy. They essentially transformed themselves into maritime fur trappers, except their pelts consisted entirely of complimentary ship amenities and minor port souvenirs. The absolute chaos began at the high-end martini bar on Deck 5. David, wearing a thick flannel shirt he had bought specifically for this persona, confidently ordered two $14 premium cocktails. When the bartender extended a hand for his room key, David slowly shook his head, reached into a leather satchel, and placed two vacuum-sealed pouches of smoked salmon and a commemorative Ketchikan thimble on the polished glass counter. He tapped the fish with his index finger and firmly stated that this was a more than equitable trade based on current maritime commodity rates. The bartender just stared at the fish, blinked twice, and asked if he needed a fork. Undeterred by this initial rejection, the couple escalated their operation. They relocated to the casino, genuinely believing that table games operated on a more flexible historical standard. Joanne marched up to a $5 minimum blackjack table, completely ignored the chips, and aggressively placed a massive bright orange frozen king crab leg directly onto the green felt betting circle. She crossed her arms and told the dealer she wanted to split eights. The pit boss had to be called over, not to handle a security threat, but to officially evaluate the casino's policy on accepting uncracked crustaceans as gambling collateral. The boss calmly picked up the freezing crab leg with a tissue, handed it back to Joanne, and explained in a perfectly monotone voice that while the house respects the harvest, they unfortunately only accept seafood at the roulette wheel. 8. Consider the profound cognitive disconnect required to treat a paved, commercialized port stop like a hostile drop into the untamed tundra. Kevin, a 24-year-old graphic designer who had clearly ingested far too many survivalist podcasts, prepared for the short, tender boat ride to Sitka, as if he were storming a frozen beachhead. While the rest of the passengers waited by the gangway holding half-empty cups of coffee and wearing comfortable fleece pullovers, Kevin stood in the stairwell fully equipped for a summit push. He wore heavy-duty crampon snowshoes, a high-visibility thermal climbing suit, and an active avalanche beacon strapped to his chest, despite the fact that it was 46 degrees and lightly drizzling. Out of sheer, restless boredom, he appointed himself the unofficial safety captain of Tender Boat No. 4. During the smooth 10-minute ride to the pier, he aggressively marched up and down the small aisle, loudly debriefing bewildered senior citizens on emergency frostbite protocols and attempting to hand out heavy iodine water purification tablets. He sternly lectured a young couple in matching windbreakers about the fatal dangers of thin ice, completely ignoring the fact that they were currently floating over 1,000 feet of liquid ocean. The true majesty of his delusion was revealed the exact moment the small boat bumped gently against the dock. Kevin practically kicked the doors open, triumphantly marched down the ramp, confidently planted his heavy metal ice axe right into the pristine, freshly poured concrete pier, and immediately asked an exhausted seasonal worker wearing a giant foam salmon costume for the fastest tactical route to the artisanal fudge shop. 9. It is genuinely terrifying to witness what happens when a highly competitive options trader from Chicago realizes there is absolutely zero cellular service in the middle of Glacier Bay. Stripped of his live market screens and completely unable to process the concept of standing still, 35-year-old Brent immediately reverted to the base instinct of unregulated capitalism. By day 4, the absolute mind-melting boredom of waiting for a piece of the Hubbard Glacier to fall into the water, a geological process that is agonizingly slow and entirely unpredictable, completely broke his mind. He decided that simply watching frozen water was a terrible return on his emotional investment, so he established a rogue open-air sportsbook on the Deck 11 aft viewing area. Brent hauled a massive rolling dry erase whiteboard out of an unlocked corporate conference room, wedged it next to the soft-serve ice cream machine, and began taking complex proposition bets. Wearing a green plastic visor he bought in the onboard gift shop, he aggressively shouted odds at elderly tourists wrapped in fleece blankets. He offered 3-to-1 odds that the massive left ice spire would collapse before noon, and even money on whether the ship's resident naturalist would use the word majestic more than 4 times in the next 10 minutes. But the collective boredom of the crowd was so profound that his operation rapidly expanded into a massive underground maritime economy. By 2 in the afternoon, Brent was taking bets on whether the next bald eagle would fly left to right or right to left across the bow. He had dozens of incredibly invested people cheering wildly at empty patches of water and screaming at seagulls to change their flight paths to cover the spread. The twist in this bizarre financial experiment was his currency. Fearing international maritime gambling laws, Brent refused to accept cash. Anticipating the notoriously rough seas of the open Pacific later in the week, he had brought a massive personal stash of prescription anti-nausea patches, and he established himself as the pharmaceutical kingpin of the ship. He was exclusively taking bets in scopolamine and premium dining reservations. By 3:00 p.m., he had amassed a fortune of 42 motion sickness patches and 6 confirmed reservations to the sold-out onboard steakhouse. The operation was ultimately dismantled when the ship's hotel director marched through the crowd, confiscated the whiteboard, and ordered Brent to cease all unregulated trading. Brent just smiled a terrifyingly smug smile and zipped up his leather duffel bag of medical winnings, feeling like the undisputed wolf of the inside passage. However, the true climax of his hubris arrived exactly 4 hours later. As the ship sailed out of the protected, glass-smooth fjords and abruptly entered the violently churning 20-foot swells of the Gulf of Alaska, Brent's stomach instantly dropped. He turned a pale shade of green, gripped the handrail, and frantically unzipped his duffel bag to apply one of his hard-earned patches. He dug through the pockets frantically, only to realize a devastating truth. In the final chaotic minutes before security shut him down, he had boldly wagered his entire pharmaceutical portfolio on a massive parlay about a breaching humpback whale. He had literally just gambled away his very last personal supply of nausea medication to an 82-year-old retired schoolteacher from Iowa, who was currently sitting completely comfortably in the steakhouse, eating a ribeye that used to belong to him. 10. If you pay close enough attention, you will quickly realize that cruise ship art auctions are specifically designed to prey on people who have completely run out of things to look at. Brenda, a retired dental hygienist from Vancouver, discovered this on day 5 of an incredibly misty, overcast itinerary. Unable to sit by the freezing pool, she wandered into the midship lounge and found herself entirely consumed by the aggressive psychology of the onboard art auction. Brenda had absolutely no interest in fine art, and her living room walls were already full. But the sheer, mind-numbing boredom of the sea day awakened a deep, dormant desire for financial dominance. She decided she was going to corner the global market on paintings of sad-looking Alaskan wildlife. Sitting in the front row with a complimentary glass of cheap champagne, Brenda became an absolute menace. Every time a Thomas Kincaid-style painting of a lonely moose standing in a frozen river was placed on the easel, her numbered paddle shot into the air like a missile. She aggressively stared down a young honeymooning couple just to outbid them by $50 on a deeply ugly watercolor of a salmon. By the end of the 2-hour event, Brenda had successfully purchased 14 distinct paintings of depressed moose. When the exhausted auctioneer invited her to the desk to arrange the exorbitant international shipping fees for her massive new collection, Brenda calmly took a sip of her champagne, handed back the paddle, and softly asked if the ship's engineering department could simply throw all 14 paintings directly into the ship's heavy fuel incinerator, explaining that she didn't actually want the art. She just desperately needed to feel alive. 11. Picture the staggering, unadulterated arrogance of a culinary snob trapped on a floating buffet. Lars, a 40-year-old artisanal butcher from Portland, booked a luxury Alaskan voyage but was immediately and deeply offended by the quality of the smoked salmon served at the morning breakfast station. Deeming it mass-produced, liquid smoke-injected garbage, Lars decided that the only way to survive the remaining 6 days was to take matters into his own hands. During a port stop in Ketchikan, he completely ignored the historical tours and instead purchased 3 pounds of raw, wild-caught silver salmon and a small bundle of decorative cedar wood from a local souvenir shop. Returning to his stateroom on Deck 9, Lars utilized his endless free time to engineer a highly illegal, makeshift cold-smoking apparatus on his balcony. He placed the raw fish inside the metal complementary ice bucket, arranged the cedar chips at the bottom, and used the bathroom hairdryer taped to a cardboard toilet paper tube to constantly circulate the air. To generate the actual smoke, he couldn't start a real fire without triggering the sprinklers, so he simply placed 4 bags of complimentary Earl Grey tea on the heating element of the cabin's coffee maker until they began to aggressively smolder, using a rolled-up cruise itinerary to fan the bergamot-scented fumes out the sliding glass door and over the raw fish. The entire starboard side of the ship soon smelled like a bizarre mixture of a London tea shop and a fish market. The grand culinary experiment ended abruptly when 2 security officers in heavy tactical vests breached the cabin, fully expecting to fight a raging electrical fire. Instead, they found Lars standing on his balcony in a plush white bathrobe, his eyes watering profusely, proudly using silver buffet tongs to offer the chief security officer a slice of lukewarm, gray, incredibly dangerous room temperature fish. The officer didn't even cite him for the fire hazard. He simply confiscated the ice bucket under the ship's strict biohazard and gastrointestinal outbreak protocols. 12. There is a very specific type of high-end beverage snob who views a luxury vacation not as a relaxing getaway, but as a grueling battlefield for his incredibly demanding palate. Meet Gregory, a 58-year-old wealth management consultant from Manhattan, who possessed a level of culinary arrogance that bordered on a psychological disorder. Gregory was deeply, personally offended by the ship's ice. By day 3 of a premium Alaskan voyage, he had already loudly complained to 4 different bartenders that the standard ice cubes from the ship's massive desalination plant contained microscopic mineral impurities. He confidently claimed these invisible minerals were actively ruining the delicate, oaky finish of his $200 a pour reserve single malt scotch. He even went so far as to bring a small pack of litmus paper to the lobby bar to publicly test the pH level of a martini. But the profound, agonizing boredom of a long, scenic cruising day through Tracy Arm Fjord pushed his arrogance into full-blown madness. Staring down from his deck 6 balcony at the small, floating chunks of brilliant blue glacial ice drifting in the freezing water, Gregory decided he required prehistoric hydration. He was going to harvest his own 10,000-year-old glacier ice. Treating his luxury cabin like a maritime hardware store, he engineered a highly elaborate, genuinely dangerous grappling hook. He disassembled 3 heavy wooden coat hangers from the closet, bound them tightly into a claw formation using an entire roll of dental floss and duct tape he had packed for emergencies, and tied the contraption to a 50-foot length of heavy braided silk cord he had blatantly unspooled from the stateroom's decorative blackout curtains. For nearly 5 agonizing hours in 34-degree weather, Gregory leaned precariously over his glass railing, violently swinging his makeshift claw at passing ice floes like a deeply unhinged, bespoke fisherman. He ruined a $400 cashmere sweater, pulled a muscle in his lower back, and nearly dropped his prescription glasses into the churning ocean, but pure, weaponized stubbornness kept him going. Finally, against all odds of physics and common sense, he successfully snagged a cantaloupe-sized, relatively clear chunk of ice and hauled it vertically up the side of the massive vessel, inch by freezing inch. Breathless, shivering violently, and completely soaked in freezing seawater, he dragged the block over his railing. He washed it meticulously in his bathroom sink, placed his prized catch inside the stateroom's silver champagne bucket, put on a tailored velvet dinner jacket, and marched down to the reserve whiskey bar on deck 5, like a conquering Roman general. He slammed the silver bucket onto the polished mahogany counter, instantly drawing a crowd of incredibly bored passengers who were desperate for any form of evening entertainment. Gregory loudly demanded that the bartender use a specialized metal pick to chisel off a perfect 2-inch sphere of his virgin ice. He then turned around and delivered a remarkably pompous 5-minute lecture to the entire quiet lounge. He informed the captive audience that they were all drinking chemically compromised, mass-produced tap water, while he was about to consume the purest, most ancient form of frozen precipitation on the planet, entirely untouched by human history, industrial pollution, or modern society. The deeply exhausted bartender wordlessly chipped a jagged piece off the block, dropped it into a heavy crystal tumbler, and poured the outrageously expensive amber liquid over it. Gregory lifted the glass to the ambient lighting to admire its clarity, closed his eyes, and took a massive, theatrical sip, fully intending to loudly describe the crispness of the Pleistocene epoch to the room. Instead, his face instantly contorted into a mask of pure, visceral horror. As the supposedly ancient ice reacted to the room temperature scotch, it rapidly began to melt, instantly releasing a cloudy, neon green dye directly into the expensive liquor. This was immediately followed by a soggy lime wedge, a partially chewed maraschino cherry stem, and a brightly colored plastic monkey-stirring stick that floated lazily to the surface of his drink. Gregory hadn't successfully harvested a piece of a 10,000-year-old Alaskan glacier. He had spent 5 grueling hours meticulously fishing out a massive, frozen, compressed clump of discarded slush from the previous night's tropical glow deck party, which a disgruntled bartender on deck 14 had simply dumped over the railing while cleaning up, allowing the sugary waste to freeze completely solid in the Arctic waters before drifting peacefully past Gregory's balcony. Let's settle this in the comments. Who takes the crown for the most embarrassing geographical meltdown? Evelyn demanding a refund from a television screen, or Martin trying to sue the captain over the rotation of the Earth? Give me your verdict. If you enjoyed this absolute circus, drop a like and subscribe. It validates my terrible habit of obsessing over other people's misery.